The ballroom held 400 people and not one of them was breathing. A 6-year-old girl had just broken free from her mother's grip and sprinted across 30 feet of marble flooring, weaving between cocktail dresses and black suits, ignoring every hand that reached for her. And she threw herself into the arms of a maintenance technician standing alone near the stage. The man caught her out of reflex. His coffee cup hit the floor. And in a room built for silence and elegance, the child's voice tore through everything. "Why did you leave me?" Nobody moved. Cameras turned. Glasses stopped midair. The girl was Ava Sterling. The woman standing frozen 20 feet away, face drained white beneath a $10,000 gown, was Victoria Sterling, 30 years old, CEO of a billion-dollar empire, and a mother who had never once seen her daughter run to a stranger before. The man holding her daughter was no one. A technician. A nobody in a gray uniform who looked like he hadn't slept right in years. He looked at the child in his arms, and something in his face broke open. If you've never watched a story like this one, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell, because the stories I tell don't end where you expect them to. Drop a like on this video and leave a comment with your city and country. I want to know how far this story has traveled. You won't want to miss what comes next. The charity gala had been Victoria Sterling's idea, the way most things in her life were. Efficient, calculated, and dressed up to look effortless. Sterling Foundation's annual fundraiser. Black tie. 400 guests. A string quartet playing something tasteful near the East Wing, while waitstaff moved through the crowd carrying trays of champagne and miniature food that cost more per bite than most people spent on dinner. Victoria had arrived 45 minutes late, which was intentional. She'd learned from watching her father that the room feels your absence before it appreciates your presence. So she'd stood outside the main doors for a moment, smoothed the front of her gown, placed her hand lightly on Ava's shoulder, and walked in. Ava had been quiet all evening. That wasn't unusual. She was a quiet child, had been since she was old enough to observe that the adults around her preferred composure to noise. She'd learned to hold herself still at events like this, to smile when introduced to strangers, to stand beside her mother without fidgeting. 6 years old and already performing adulthood in small, careful doses. Victoria held her daughter's hand as they moved through the room. Handshakes, introductions, brief conversations she managed on autopilot, while one part of her brain cataloged who was present, who wasn't, and what that meant for the acquisition deal currently hanging like weather in the background of every professional interaction she had. Ava walked beside her, obedient, contained. And then she stopped. Victoria felt it before she registered it, the slight resistance in her palm as Ava's hand went tight, then the sudden absence of weight as her daughter's fingers slipped free. "Ava!" But the girl was already moving. Victoria turned and watched her 6-year-old daughter sprint across the ballroom floor in a pale blue dress, cutting through the crowd with the single-minded determination of a child who had seen something that made every rule irrelevant. People stepped back. Heads turned. The quartet hit a discordant note and trailed off. Ava reached the man near the stage and threw herself into him so hard he stumbled backward a full step. He caught her. Both arms. The coffee cup in his right hand dropped and cracked against the marble, and the sound rang out through the silent room like a gunshot. Victoria couldn't move. She watched her daughter bury her face in this man's collar. A maintenance uniform, gray, with a small logo on the chest. And the sound that came out of Ava was something Victoria had never heard from her before. It wasn't crying exactly. It was something rawer than that, something dug out from deep. "Why did you leave me?" The words landed in the room and stayed there. Victoria started walking. She kept her face neutral the way she'd trained herself to, a board meeting expression, controlled and unreadable, but her pulse was doing something she didn't have a word for. Around her, phones were rising. She registered that with a separate, cold part of her mind. 400 people with cameras and a moment they couldn't quite understand but knew instinctively was worth capturing. She reached them in under 10 seconds. The man was still holding Ava. He hadn't pulled away, hadn't tried to set her down or create distance, and that struck Victoria as either the instinct of a good person or the performance of a very skilled one. She didn't know which yet. He was taller than she'd expected, broad through the shoulders in a way that the uniform couldn't quite hide. Late 30s, maybe 37. He had the kind of face that hadn't been particularly gentle with time. A faded scar along his jaw, the skin around his eyes carrying lines from too much sun and not enough sleep. Dark hair going gray at the temples. He met her gaze over the top of Ava's head, and for a single second, he looked the way a person looks when they've been hit by something they thought they'd already survived. Excuse me. Victoria's voice came out quieter than she intended. She cleared her throat and said it again, steadier. I need you to put my daughter down. The man didn't move immediately. He said something first, quietly, close to Ava's ear, and Ava lifted her face and looked at Victoria with red-rimmed eyes that weren't surprised or confused. They were, Victoria realized, the eyes of a child who had found something she thought was gone and was waiting to see if it would be taken away again. Slowly, the man lowered Ava until her feet touched the floor. He kept one hand loosely at her back while she stood. Victoria crouched and pulled her daughter close, turning so that her own body was between Ava and the man. She pressed her lips to Ava's hair, then she straightened and turned to face him. Who are you? Ethan Cross? No hesitation. Building maintenance. I've been contracted here for 3 weeks for the renovations on the East Wing. My daughter seems to know you. Something moved across his face. Not guilt, more complicated than guilt. I knew her when she was younger. I worked at your family's estate. Before. The word sat wrong. Victoria was good at noticing words that sat wrong. Before what? She said. Ethan Cross looked at her for a moment. The room was still too quiet around them. She was aware of it, the specific silence of a crowd that has stopped pretending not to watch. Before I was asked to leave, he said. Victoria stood very still. Asked by whom? He didn't answer that. He looked down at Ava, who was still standing at Victoria's side with both hands wrapped around her mother's arm, watching him with that same devastated steadiness she'd had since she first ran across the room. This isn't the right place, Ethan said quietly. You don't get to decide what the right place is, Victoria said. You're standing in the middle of my fundraiser holding my daughter. I didn't hold anyone. His voice didn't rise. That was the thing that struck her. He didn't get defensive, didn't over-explain, didn't perform the kind of anxious deference that most people offered when confronted by someone with her particular combination of money and displeasure. He just said this factual thing calmly and waited. She ran to you. Yes. You've met her once before, 3 weeks ago, when you arrived for the renovations? Something shifted in his expression. No. Victoria looked at him. Then when? He glanced once at Ava, then back at her. She was about 8 months old the first time I met her, and I worked at the Sterling estate for almost 2 years after that. The math landed slowly, the way cold water lands when it's unexpected. Ava would have been... Victoria was doing numbers in her head and not liking where they arrived. That's not possible, she said. I would have known... Would you? The words weren't cruel. They were just honest in a way that cut anyway. Victoria's jaw tightened. What exactly is that supposed to mean? Ethan didn't answer that either. He picked up the broken coffee cup from the floor in 2 pieces and set them on the edge of the stage behind him. Then he straightened and looked at her with the same steady, careful expression he'd worn since she approached. I was ordered to disappear, he said. That's all I can tell you right now. Not because I won't. Because this room is full of cameras and your daughter is standing right there. Ava looked up at her mother. Her eyes were dry now, but the expression on her face was the one that had been appearing at intervals for years. That quiet, waiting look that Victoria had never been able to decode. That emptiness behind the patience. Victoria looked at it now and thought, she's been waiting for something. She reached down and took Ava's hand. Don't go anywhere tonight, she said to Ethan Cross. I want to talk to you before you leave this building. He nodded once. I'll be here. She found him at 11:15, after the guests had thinned and Ava had been taken home by her nanny and the catering staff was beginning to break things down. He was sitting in a folding chair near the service entrance, not hiding, but not presenting himself either. Just waiting, the way a man waits who is used to waiting in uncomfortable places without complaint. Victoria sat down across from him without asking permission. It was her building, she didn't need it, and put her phone face down on the table between them. Talk, she said. Ethan leaned forward with his forearms on his knees and looked at the floor for a second. Then he looked up. I was hired to the Sterling estate 7 years ago as a general maintenance and security contractor. I wasn't there as a nanny. I wasn't paid to look after Ava, but she was. She was a difficult baby. Colicky, didn't sleep right, and I was there at all hours, and she... He stopped, seemed to choose his words with some care. She got used to me being around. I'd be working in the East Wing at 2 in the morning, and she'd be crying, and I'd walk her around until she stopped. That's how it started. Victoria was quiet. She was trying to feel offended and finding it harder than she expected. For the first year and a half, I was just a guy who happened to be around, Ethan continued. But by the time she was close to 2, she'd started... I was more familiar to her than most people. Your household had a lot of turnover. Staff changed frequently. Victoria knew that. She'd been in the middle of the company's most aggressive expansion period. She'd been in a different city more weeks than not. She didn't say any of that. My father arranged your departure, she said instead. It wasn't a question. The answer had started to assemble itself the moment he'd said ordered. Your father's executive team, Ethan said. I dealt with a woman named Miranda Hale. She called me into a meeting and told me that my relationship with Ava had become inappropriate, her word, and that if I didn't resign immediately, there'd be consequences. He said it matter-of-factly, with no particular bitterness. I told her I'd leave, but I wanted a chance to tell Ava goodbye. A proper goodbye. She was 2. I'd been a fixture in her life for almost 2 years. I just wanted to... He paused. I wanted her to know it wasn't her fault, that I didn't choose to go. Victoria's chest was doing something she didn't have permission for. She kept her expression controlled. They refused that? Flat refusal. I was walked off the property the same day. And Ava was told I moved away. That's what the nanny said years later when I tracked her down. She was told I moved away and that people move away sometimes. He looked at his hands. She was 2. She didn't understand moving away. She just understood gone. The room was nearly empty now. The string quartet cases were stacked near the door. Somewhere in the kitchen, someone was running water. Victoria picked up her phone and turned it over in her hands without looking at it. Why didn't you fight it? She asked. You were military. I was former military, and I had a son to think about. He said it simply. Noah was 4. His mother had left 2 years before. I was the only person he had. I couldn't afford a legal fight with the Sterling family. I couldn't afford to lose. He looked up. So I left. And Ava grew up thinking you abandoned her. Ethan was quiet for a moment. I've lived with that every day for 6 years. Victoria sat back. She looked at the man across from her. The calluses on his hands, the careful stillness he held in his body that she now recognized as the kind of discipline that comes from years of being in situations where losing control of yourself has real consequences. There was nothing performative about him. No sales pitch, no attempt to win her over. That, more than anything he'd said, was what made her believe him. She pulled a card from the small clutch on the table and set it in front of him. That's my private line. Don't call before 7 in the morning. She stood. I'm going to look into what you've told me tonight. If you're lying about any part of it, I'm not. If you are, she continued, I have resources that will make the consequences of whatever Miranda Hale threatened you with look like a minor inconvenience. I know what your resources are. Again, no defensiveness, just fact. She started toward the door, then stopped. My daughter is perceptive, she said without turning. She doesn't attach to people easily. Never has. She paused. She's been asking me for years why her friend had to move away. I told her I didn't know. She didn't wait for a response. She walked out through the main doors into the cool night air and stood on the steps for a long moment before she let herself exhale. The investigation she ran on Ethan Cross began the next morning, and she ran it quietly, the same way she ran anything she didn't want getting back to the wrong people. She started with public records. Military service, 7 years, 2 full deployments, medals she didn't immediately recognize but had her assistant research. The kind of record that didn't typically belong to a man who'd later take building maintenance contracts in the city. She asked a contact in HR to pull the archived employment records from the estate 7 years back. The name Ethan Cross appeared in the system, but the file was thin. Thinner than it should have been for a 2-year contractor. Several documents had been removed. She could see the gaps in the metadata. She called the woman who had run her household during those years. Retired now, living in a smaller city upstate. The conversation was brief, but the woman's voice told her things the words didn't. Careful, cautious. The pauses where a person speaks when they're deciding how much trouble they want. He was good to her, the woman finally said. Your father believed he was a liability. That was the word they used. Miranda made sure of that. Victoria hung up the call and sat at her desk for a few minutes without moving. Then she pulled Miranda Hale's personnel file and started reading more carefully. Meanwhile, and she wouldn't know this for several more days, Ethan Cross returned to his apartment that night, sat at the kitchen table until midnight, and then walked quietly down the hall and stood in the doorway of his son's room. Noah was asleep on his stomach with his arm around a pillow and a library book open on the floor beside the bed. He was 7. He had a gap in his front teeth and a collection of rocks on his windowsill, and he was the reason Ethan had learned to cook things other than eggs. Ethan stood there for a while. Then he went back to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water he didn't drink, and sat with the weight of an evening he hadn't been prepared for. The small hands grabbing his uniform, the voice he'd tried for 6 years not to imagine, the way the question, "Why did you leave me?" had sat in the air of that ballroom like something that had been waiting a very long time to be asked. He hadn't cried. He wouldn't. That wasn't the kind of man he'd built himself into. But he sat there for a long time in the quiet of the apartment, listening to his son breathe down the hall, and he thought about the different ways a person carries guilt, the ways it gets heavy in your chest in the dead hours of the night, when the things you couldn't protect feel closer than the things you managed to keep. He'd made Noah pancakes in the morning. He'd signed the school permission slip he'd nearly forgotten. He'd shown up to Noah's soccer practice and stood on the sideline in the October cold and hollered when his kid got a good kick in, embarrassing them both. He'd done all of it carrying what he always carried. He was used to that by now. What he wasn't used to was the possibility that it wasn't finished. That a small girl in a pale blue dress might still be waiting for an answer he'd been told he wasn't allowed to give. He looked at his phone. Victoria Sterling's card was in his jacket pocket in the hall. He thought about all the ways this could go badly. Then he turned the kitchen light off and went to bed. Victoria spent the first 3 days telling herself she was being thorough, not obsessive. She had a system. She'd always had a system. When she needed to understand something, a company she was considering acquiring, a market shift that didn't quite add up, a board member whose loyalty she wasn't certain of, she gathered information methodically, assembled it without rushing, and drew conclusions only when the picture was complete. Emotion had no place in that process. She'd learned that from her father, which was an irony she wasn't ready to sit with yet. So she worked the way she always worked. Quietly, early in the morning before her assistant arrived, cross-referencing employment records with security logs from the estate, pulling contractor invoices from the archived financial system, reading through 7-year-old emails she hadn't thought about since they were sent. The picture assembled itself with the kind of slow clarity that felt almost worse than a sudden revelation, because she couldn't point to a single moment and say that's where I was deceived. It was everywhere. It had been everywhere for years. Ethan Cross had been contracted to the Sterling estate in October, 7 years ago. His role was listed as maintenance and general building services, which was accurate but incomplete. The security notes from that period showed he'd also been flagged twice by estate security for going beyond the formal scope of his work. Once for fixing a fence in the back garden that wasn't his assigned area. Once for sitting with Ava in the nursery for 2 hours during a power outage when the night nurse was sick and the backup hadn't arrived. Both flags had been reviewed. Both had been dismissed as non-issues by the same person, Miranda Hale, who at the time served as the executive operations liaison between the Sterling Corporation's board and the estate's household management. Victoria read that twice. She hadn't known Miranda had that kind of reach into the household at that point. Miranda had always been a corporate presence, efficient, polished, the kind of person who spoke in complete paragraphs and wore the same severe blazer silhouette in every color. She'd risen steadily over 6 years, accumulating influence the way certain people did, quietly and sideways, rather than by direct promotion. Victoria had trusted her with operational decisions because Miranda never gave her a reason not to. She was reliable. She never overpromised. She sent clean reports. She was, Victoria now understood, extremely good at making herself necessary. The retirement community where Ava's former night nurse lived was 2 hours outside the city, which meant Victoria had to block 3 hours out of a Wednesday that could not afford 3 hours. She did it anyway. She told her assistant she had a personal appointment and took her own car, which she rarely did. Driving herself felt strange now, the muscle memory of it slightly off. the way something feels when you haven't used it in years. The nurse's name was Dolores Webb. She was 71, living in a tidy apartment with a terrace full of potted plants she'd clearly been tending for a long time. She answered the door in a cardigan and reading glasses and looked at Victoria with an expression that wasn't quite surprise. "I wondered if someone would come eventually," Dolores said. They sat in the small front room with cups of tea Dolores made without asking whether Victoria wanted any. Victoria found she didn't mind. She wrapped her hands around the mug and watched the older woman settle across from her. "You knew Ethan Cross," Victoria said. "Everyone on the overnight staff knew him. He was there more hours than most of us." Dolores set her own mug on the side table. "He was good with her, your daughter. She had bad nights. You probably know that she was colicky for the first several months, and he'd hear her on his way past the nursery and he'd stop, every time, without being asked." "How long did that go on?" "The whole time he was there, nearly 2 years. Dolores looked at her steadily. "He taught himself nursery rhymes. He wasn't the type, you understand. Big, quiet man, looked like he'd seen things. But he'd stand there at 2 in the morning, walking her in circles and singing these terrible rhymes in a voice like a broken radio, and she'd stop crying." A pause. "She loved him. At 2 years old, she loved him. You could see it." Victoria was quiet. The tea was going cold in her hands. "When he left," she started. "He didn't leave. He was walked out." Dolores' voice didn't rise, but something in it sharpened. "That woman from the company called him in without warning. I heard the aftermath from the security staff. He came out looking like something had been removed from him, asked to see Ava one last time, was told no. Security walked him to his truck." She folded her hands in her lap. "Ava asked for him every night for 3 weeks. I was told to tell her he'd moved away." Victoria put the mug down on the coffee table. The sound it made was too loud for the quiet room. "I told her that," Dolores said, softer now. "I told a 2-year-old that her person had moved away. Because I needed the job, and because I was told it was the right thing, and because—" She stopped. Her jaw worked for a second. "Because sometimes we do what we're told and we live with it afterward. That's what I did." "Do you know why Miranda had him removed?" Victoria asked. "The real reason." "I know what the excuse was. That it was inappropriate. The attachment had become unhealthy for the child. That's what I heard. That it created liability." Dolores looked at her with something that wasn't quite pity. "Your daughter having a person who made her feel safe was a liability to someone. You figure out what that tells you." Victoria drove back to the city in a silence that felt different from the silence going out. It had more texture to it, more weight. She didn't call the office when she arrived. She sat in the car in the parking structure beneath her building for 11 minutes and did something she almost never did at work. She let herself feel the full shape of what she'd just learned without immediately converting it into a plan of action. Her daughter had spent 6 years with a quiet absence in her. That waiting look. That particular stillness in her eyes at certain moments that Victoria had attributed to temperament, to shyness, to the natural disposition of an introverted child. It wasn't temperament, it was grief. The particular grief of a very young child who didn't have the language to name what had been taken from them. Only the body knowledge that someone essential had disappeared. Victoria had looked at that grief for 6 years and called it something else. She got out of the car, straightened her jacket, and went back to work. Because that's what she knew how to do. But something had shifted in the internal architecture of how she was holding this situation, and she knew it wouldn't shift back. She called Ethan that evening. He picked up on the third ring. "I went to see Dolores Webb today," she said. A short silence. "How is she?" The question caught her off guard. The naturalness of it, the way he immediately asked about the person rather than what the person had said. "She's fine. She told me about the nights. With Ava." Another silence, one different. "I'm not looking for credit," he said. "I'm not offering any. I'm telling you I know more than I did 3 days ago." She paused. "I pulled your employment records from the estate. Some of the documents had been removed." "I figured they would be." "Miranda removed them." "I figured that too." Victoria moved to the window of her home office. The city below was doing its usual thing, indifferent and continuous. "What did she threaten you with specifically?" "You said consequences. What kind?" "She had a contact at the licensing board that governed my security contractor certification. She implied it could become difficult to maintain. He said it the same way he said everything, but not dramatized, just reported. And she mentioned Noah. Nothing specific, just, you have a son to think about. The implication was enough. The deliberateness of it landed in Victoria's stomach like something dropped from a height. She mentioned your child. Yes. To get you to leave without a fight. It worked, he said, simply, without self-reproach, which almost made it worse. Victoria stood at the window for a moment. I want to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. All right. Did you ever think about coming back? In 6 years. Did you ever think about finding a way to every day? No hesitation. Every single day. And I had reasons not to every time. Noah needed stability. A legal fight I couldn't win would have cost him that. And I told myself Ava was young enough that she'd forget, that it was better for her. He stopped. I was wrong about that last part. Yes, Victoria said. You were. She ended the call shortly after and stood in the quiet of her office thinking about the particular cruelty of decisions that are made for the right reasons and turn out to be the wrong ones, and about how rarely those two things are as separate as people need to believe they are. Her father called the next morning. She let it ring. She wasn't ready for that conversation yet. She needed more pieces in place before she looked her father in the eye, literal or otherwise, and asked him what he'd known and when he'd known it. Because she understood already that this hadn't been entirely Miranda's operation. Miranda was capable and calculated, but removing a contractor from the Sterling estate required sign-off from someone with actual authority. Miranda had never had that authority independently. Someone had given her cover. Victoria pulled the board records from 7 years ago and started working backward through every decision Miranda had been involved in that required executive authorization. It took most of the afternoon, and it turned up more than she'd expected. Miranda's fingerprints were on 3 other personnel decisions from that period that had also resulted in quiet exits and thinned files. 2 former staff members, 1 contractor. She sent a quiet message to her legal team. She used language that was careful and did not yet name anyone. She said she had questions about historical employment practices at the estate and needed a privileged review. What she didn't do was tell the board. Not yet. The board had Miranda on it now, had elevated her 3 years ago to a senior executive position, and Victoria wasn't in the habit of alerting the person she was investigating. She knew how to be patient. She'd learned it in the same rooms as Miranda, which meant she knew exactly how Miranda thought, which meant she had an advantage she intended to keep until she was ready to use it. What she hadn't counted on was Miranda moving first. The first story appeared on a Tuesday, 4 days after the gala. A media outlet that covered corporate and society news ran a piece with the headline, "Who is the mystery man at the Sterling Gala, and why is Victoria Sterling asking questions?" The piece was vague enough to avoid being actionable, but specific enough to do damage. It described the incident at the gala in detail that could only have come from a first-hand account. Someone in that room had been a source. It characterized Ethan as a former employee with a fixation on the Sterling family, mentioned his military past in a tone that implied instability rather than service, and quoted sources close to the Sterling Corporation expressing concern about the CEO's judgment. Victoria read the piece at 6:40 in the morning and called her communications director before 7. "I need to know which outlets Miranda has relationships with," she said. "Personal relationships, not corporate. That's a fairly broad inquiry. Narrow it to anyone who would run an unverified piece that could embarrass me without calling me for comment first." She paused. That should shorten the list considerably. 2 more pieces appeared in the following days. They escalated incrementally, more specific about Ethan, less specific about sourcing. One ran a photograph taken at the gala, zoomed in on the moment Ava was in his arms, cropped in a way that removed Victoria from the frame entirely and made it look less like a reunion and more like something to be worried about. The caption asked questions without answering them. Victoria's phone ran hot with board members. 3 called in the first day. 2 more sent emails with language that was measured but clearly nervous. The particular nervousness of people who have money in something and have just seen a headline they don't like. She managed them the way she managed everything when she was tired and under pressure and running low on patience, with a deliberateness that looked like calm from the outside and felt, from the inside, like holding a door shut against something that wanted to push through. What she hadn't managed, because she hadn't anticipated it, was Ava. Ava had seen one of the pieces. Not the first one, the second, which had run a sidebar with Ethan's name alongside language about allegations of inappropriate attachment. Ava was 6, and she couldn't read all of it, but she could read her own name. And she could read his. Victoria found her daughter sitting on the floor of the hallway outside Victoria's home office at 8:15 on a Thursday night, with the tablet in her lap and her face doing something controlled and careful that no 6-year-old should have learned how to do. Mama, Ava looked up. Is Ethan in trouble? Victoria sat down on the floor beside her. It took a moment. The suit she was wearing wasn't designed for it, and the hallway floor was hard. But she sat, and she took the tablet from Ava's hands and set it aside. He's not in trouble, she said. It says things about him. Ava's voice was precise, the way it got when she was working to keep it from wobbling. Bad things. Some people are saying things that aren't true. Why? Victoria looked at her daughter's face. The question was genuine, not rhetorical, not angry, just a 6-year-old asking why the way children do, because they still believe that bad things require explanations. Because some people don't want the truth to come out, Victoria said, and when they're scared of it, they try to make a lot of noise to cover it up. Ava considered that. What truth? That Ethan didn't do anything wrong, that he was a good person who got treated badly, and that the people responsible for that don't want anyone to find out. Ava looked at the tablet, then back at her mother. Is it your fault that he got treated badly? The question hit like a hand to the chest. Victoria felt the air leave her for a second. Not entirely, she said, but partly. Some people who worked for our family made a decision I didn't know about, and I should have known. That's on me. Ava was quiet for a long moment. She picked at the hem of her pajama shirt, which had a small strawberry pattern on it, faded from washing. Then she said, He told me it wasn't my fault. That night at the gala. He said it quietly when he put me down. I heard him. Victoria's throat did something she didn't plan for. She managed to keep her voice level. It wasn't. None of it was. Is he going to get to stay this time? She looked at her daughter. At the careful hope in that question, hope that had been waiting 6 years to have something to anchor to, and was now holding itself very still because it had been disappointed before and remembered what that felt like. I'm working on it, Victoria said. It wasn't the promise Ava wanted. She could see that. But it was the honest answer, and she'd decided, somewhere in the last week, somewhere between the drive to Dolores Webb's apartment and the silent car park and the late nights with the archived records, that honest answers were what her daughter was owed from here forward, even when they were incomplete. Ava leaned sideways and rested her head against Victoria's arm. They sat there on the hallway floor for a while, the tablet dark beside them. What Victoria didn't say, what she held to herself in the quiet of the hallway, was that the media pieces hadn't only been about Ethan. She'd run a financial analysis that afternoon that connected 3 of the sourcing patterns to contacts with ties to the Harlow Group, a private equity firm that had been circling the Sterling Corporation's data assets for 2 years. The leaked acquisition documents that had appeared online 3 days ago, documents that had been confined to an executive committee of 6 people, pointed to the same direction. Miranda wasn't just trying to remove Ethan from the picture. She was dismantling the company's negotiating position from the inside, feeding information to an outside party in exchange for something Victoria hadn't yet identified but intended to. The story had turned into something larger than a man who'd been wrongfully driven away and a child who'd missed him. It had a second chamber to it, a longer, colder conspiracy that had been running quietly behind the face of things for long enough that it had started to look like the scenery. Victoria was building the case. She had the financial threads. She had the personnel records, or the absences where records should have been. She had Dolores Webb's testimony. She had her own father's role still to fully understand, which was a conversation she was dreading in a way she rarely dreaded anything. What she needed was time, and time was the one resource Miranda was actively taking from her. She called Ethan the following morning. It was early, before 7, which she told him not to call before, but she was the one calling. He picked up on the second ring, which meant he'd been awake. I saw the pieces, he said, before she could open. I know where they're coming from. I figured you would. A pause. I want you to know I'm not going to respond to any of it, publicly. I know how it looks, me staying silent. But I'm not going to make your job harder. She hadn't expected that. Why not? Because you're the one who can actually fix this. I'm just the guy in the story. You're the one with the tools. He said it without resentment, like a man who had assessed the situation honestly and reached an unsentimental conclusion. And because Noah is watching, I don't want my kid to see me in a media fight. He's 7. Victoria was quiet a moment. That's a remarkably uncomplicated way to think about it. I've had practice at choosing what matters. She thought about that for a second. I need 2 more weeks, she said. The case I'm building against Miranda needs 2 more weeks to be airtight. If I move before it's ready, she has room to maneuver. I can't give her room. 2 weeks, he repeated. Okay. The board is going to pressure me to act on the media situation before then, to put distance between the company and you. She said it directly because there was no kind way to say it. I won't do that, but you should know it's what's being asked. Another silence. I appreciate you telling me. I'm not telling you to be kind. I'm telling you because you deserve to know what's happening in a situation that directly affects your life. She paused. Which is more than you were given 7 years ago. He didn't respond immediately. She heard him breathe, heard the background sounds of wherever he was, something that might have been a child's television, distant. Then, thank you, Victoria. It was the first time he'd used her name. She noticed that. 2 weeks, she said again, and ended the call. She stood at her window for a moment. The city was gray that morning, an October sky with no particular ambition, the kind of weather that just existed without announcement. She had a board meeting in 4 hours and a communications crisis ongoing and a legal team working overtime on documents she hadn't fully told them the scope of yet. She thought about Ava on the hallway floor with her strawberry pajamas and her careful hope. She thought about a man standing in a parking lot 7 years ago, being walked to his truck by a state security, asking for 10 minutes with a 2-year-old and being told no. She thought about the fact that she had spent her entire professional life building something that turned out to have a rot in one of its beams, and that the rot had a face she knew well, and that the person who'd allowed that face too much access and too little oversight was, in some measure, herself. She turned from the window and picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. There was work to do. There was always work to do. But this time she understood what it was actually for. Not the quarterly numbers, not the share price, not the acquisition the board was anxious about. Those were real, and she'd handle them, but underneath them, driving the whole operation, was something simpler and more urgent. A promise she'd made to a 6-year-old sitting on a hardwood floor who had learned too young how to hold her hope gently so it didn't break when it got dropped. Victoria did not intend to drop it again. The 2 weeks Victoria had asked for lasted 9 days before everything broke ahead of schedule. It started on a Friday, the way bad things often do. When people are mentally already somewhere else, when attention is fractured, when the work week has burned down to its last hours and defenses are lowest. Victoria was in a conference call with the legal team when her assistant knocked twice and opened the door without waiting, which was the signal they'd established for things that couldn't wait. She held up one finger to the room, muted herself, and looked at her assistant. The Harlow Group released a statement, her assistant said, and her voice had the careful flatness of someone delivering news they don't want to be the messenger for. They're announcing a formal bid for the Data Services Division. They're citing internal mismanagement and leadership instability as justification for the aggressive timeline. Victoria unmuted the call. I need to step off. I'll send revised notes within the hour. She ended it before anyone could respond. The Harlow Group's statement was 4 paragraphs long, legally careful, and built on the leaked acquisition documents that had appeared online 8 days ago. Documents that had been in the hands of 6 people, one of whom was Miranda Hale. Victoria read the statement twice. Then she called her general counsel and said, without preamble, I need to know how fast we can move on the personnel action we discussed. Victoria, if we move without completing the audit, how fast? A pause. 72 hours, if we compress the review. But the evidentiary chain needs to be... Build it in 72 hours. She ended the call. She spent the next 4 hours at her desk working through documents she'd been assembling for 2 weeks, cross-referencing financial transfers, email metadata, and access logs from the secure server that housed the acquisition files. The pattern was clean once you knew to look for it. Miranda had accessed the documents 17 times over a 3-week period, each access logged at irregular hours, several from outside the corporate network using a VPN that routed through a third-party server. The server, when traced, had ties to a consulting firm that shared two board members with the Harlow Group. It was good evidence, not yet complete evidence. The difference mattered enormously. What Victoria needed, what would make the chain unbreakable, was the financial transaction connecting Miranda directly to a payment from the Harlow Group or its affiliates. She had circumstantial threads. She needed the wire. She was still working on that when her phone rang at 7:40 in the evening. It was Ava's nanny. "Mrs. Sterling, I'm sorry to call. I know you said not to interrupt unless—" "What happened?" "Ava is— we can't find her." The woman's voice was working to hold itself together and not quite managing. "She was in the garden 20 minutes ago. I stepped inside for— it was less than 5 minutes, I promise you. And when I went back, she was gone. The gate to the back property was open. I've checked the whole house. Security is looking at the grounds now." Victoria was already standing, already reaching for her jacket. "Call estate security. Get the full perimeter team. Don't call the police yet. Give me 20 minutes. She was moving toward the door. "And call Ethan Cross. His number is in my contacts under E. Tell him what's happened. Tell him exactly what you told me." She was in the car 7 minutes later. The drive to the estate was 35 minutes on a good night, 25 if she pushed it. She pushed it. The rain had started around 6 and deepened through the evening into a steady, serious downpour. The kind that turned the estate grounds into something you wouldn't want to navigate in the dark. Victoria's hands were steady on the wheel, and her mind was doing what it did when things went wrong, which was move fast and cold and cut everything down to what was immediately necessary. Ava was 6. She knew the estate well. The back property ran almost 4 acres, manicured near the house, increasingly wild toward the boundary, with 2 small outbuildings and a stretch of mature trees along the northern edge. In daylight and dry, it was safe enough. In a rainstorm, at night, with a 6-year-old who'd been upset for days, Victoria did not let that train of thought continue. She drove. The security team had 6 people on the grounds when she arrived. 2 had flashlights working the tree line. 2 were moving through the garden. The estate manager met her at the back door, looking like a man who'd aged several years in the last 20 minutes. "Nothing yet," he said. "No sign at the boundary. She hasn't left the property. We'd have triggered the perimeter sensors." "She's still here." Victoria stepped past him into the rain. "Where are we on the outbuildings?" "The groundskeeper's shed was locked and we have the key. Empty." "The old guest house?" He hesitated. "What about the guest house?" "We checked the exterior. The door was locked." "Did you go inside?" Another hesitation, shorter. "No. We don't have a key on site. The guest house hasn't been used in— Get someone on that door." She was already moving across the lawn, rain immediately plastering her hair to her face, her heels sinking into the wet grass with each step. She pulled out her phone to call Ethan and found he was already calling her. She picked up. "Where are you?" "Pulling through your main gate now." His voice was level. Background sound of rain and engine. "What do we know?" "She's on the property. Perimeter sensors are clean. We haven't checked the interior of the old guest house." A pause as she navigated around a section of garden border. "It's been locked and unused for years. I don't know why she'd go there." She heard him go quiet for a second. Just 1 second. Then, "I do." Something in his voice, not alarm but a kind of recognition, made her stop walking. "What?" "Which guest house? North end of the property?" "Yes." "There's a nightlight in the second room on the left. Or there was, 7 years ago. I replaced the bulb once. It's shaped like a small moon. She used to call it the moonlight." Another pause. "When she was upset, I'd walk her out there some nights. It was quiet. Away from the main house. She liked the dark outside the window." Victoria stood in the rain and felt something move through her that was too big to name right now and too important to ignore entirely. She filed it. She kept moving. "Get to the north end," she said into the phone. "The security team is working on the door. Tell them to stop." His voice was quiet but definite. "If she's in there and scared and she hears people forcing a door, she'll panic. She'll try to hide harder." Victoria relayed that to the estate manager in 4 words. He called the team off. She reached the guest house 2 minutes later. Ethan arrived from the opposite direction. He'd come around the north boundary road, 30 seconds after that. He was in a jacket that was already soaked through and carrying a small flashlight. and he moved across the wet grass with the particular economy of someone who was not thinking about the rain or the dark or the difficulty of the terrain. I was thinking about one thing. Victoria fell into step beside him. How do we get in? Back window, ground floor, east side. The latch was loose. I reported it twice and they never fixed it. He said it without accusation, just information. If she got in that way, she knows this place better than I thought. She's her mother's daughter, Victoria said, and meant it as neither pride nor apology. The window was unlocked. Ethan worked it open with both hands, taking his time, making as little noise as possible. He shone the flashlight through the gap first. A narrow slice of interior, dusty, empty-looking, furniture under sheets. Then he climbed through with a fluency that said his body knew exactly how to do this, the particular careful movement of someone who'd entered difficult spaces in difficult conditions before. He reached back and offered Victoria his hand. She took it and climbed through without comment. Inside, the guest house smelled of dust and old wood and the faint mineral smell of the rain coming through. The floors were dark hardwood, thick with quiet. Victoria turned on her phone light and kept it low. Ethan moved ahead of her down the narrow hallway, testing each floorboard before he put his weight down, moving in near silence. The second door on the left was slightly ajar. He stopped outside it, held up one hand. Wait. Then he crouched down to approximately the height a 6-year-old would be if they were sitting on the floor, and looked through the gap. He stayed there for a moment. Then he turned and looked back at Victoria, and the expression on his face in the dim light was one she wouldn't entirely forget. Relief and something that had been carrying weight for a very long time and was still too cautious to set it down yet. He held up one finger. She's in there. Victoria's hand tightened on her phone. Ethan turned back to the door. He didn't push it open. He sat down on the floor of the hallway, cross-legged, about 3 feet from the gap, and said, in a voice that was barely above normal speaking volume, easy, unhurried, "Hey!" Silence from inside. Then, very small. "Ethan?" "Yeah." He shifted slightly, getting comfortable, like a man prepared to sit on a cold floor for however long it took. "It's raining pretty hard outside. You doing okay in there?" A pause. Longer this time. Victoria stood against the wall and held herself completely still. "I heard them talking." Ava's voice was thick. She'd been crying. Victoria could hear the residue of it, the stuffed quality of a child who had cried for a while and stopped and was now sitting in the aftermath. "The news people, they said you were bad. They said you were—" Her voice wobbled and she stopped herself. "I don't want you to be bad." "I'm not bad," Ethan said, calmly. Not quickly, not with protest, just with the steadiness of a true thing being stated. "But they said, some people are saying things that aren't true about me right now. That happens sometimes to people. It's not a good thing, but it happens, and it doesn't mean the lies are true." A silence. Then, "Why would they lie?" "Because the truth is a problem for them. And when the truth is a problem for certain people, they try to bury it under a lot of noise." He paused. "Your mom is working on it. She's going to figure it out." "She always figures things out," Ava said. There was something in her voice that wasn't quite uncomplicated pride, a child's awareness that their parent is capable, and the slightly separate awareness of what that capability has sometimes cost in terms of presence. "She does," Ethan said. Another silence, longer this time. Victoria heard rain against the window glass inside the room. She heard Ava shift, the small sound of a child repositioning on a floor. "I thought if I came here it would—" Ava stopped, started again. "I remembered the moonlight. I remembered you brought me here when I was sad. I didn't know if it still worked." "Does it?" A pause. "It's still there. It's kind of dim, but it's still there. Things that have been sitting in the dark for a long time are sometimes dim when you first turn them on," Ethan said. "Doesn't mean they're broken." Victoria closed her eyes for a second. "Are you going to go away again?" Ava asked. The question was quiet, but it had the compressed weight of 6 years behind it. The question she'd been rebuilding towards since the night at the gala. "No," Ethan said. "Not, I'll try not to, or I hope not, or the soft hedging of an adult who wants to make a child feel better without fully committing. Just no. But I need you to come out of there and talk to your mom, okay? She's been very scared. Being scared is uncomfortable, and we shouldn't let her stay in it longer than necessary. Rustling from inside, small footsteps. The door swung open. Ava stood in the doorway in her rain jacket. She'd grabbed it on her way out, which said something about her practical nature even at 6. With wet hair stuck to her cheeks and her eyes swollen from crying, and her expression doing the thing it had been doing since the gala, trying to hold too many feelings in a face too small for all of them. She looked at Ethan first. Then she looked at Victoria. Mama. Victoria covered the distance in 2 steps and went down to her knees on the dusty floor without a thought for the suit, and Ava walked into her arms, and Victoria held on with the kind of grip that comes from genuine fear, the real thing, not the performed version. I'm sorry, Ava said into her shoulder. Don't. Victoria pulled back just enough to look at her daughter's face. Don't be sorry for being scared. You're allowed to be scared. I made everyone worried. Yes. And we'll talk about running off without telling anyone because that's not safe and it matters. But right now I just need... She stopped, pulled her daughter back in. Right now I just need this. They stayed like that for a moment on the floor of a cold hallway in an abandoned guest house in the rain. Victoria was aware of Ethan a few feet away, giving them space, his back half turned, looking at the window at the far end of the hall. She was aware of how wet she was, and how her knees would complain about this floor tomorrow, and how none of that was remotely relevant. Eventually, Ava pulled back and looked past Victoria at Ethan. You knew where I was. I remembered where you used to go when things got hard. He looked at her evenly. You haven't changed as much as you think. Ava considered that. You remembered the moonlight. I remember a lot of things. She looked at him for a moment, the assessing look of a child who is deciding whether to say the thing they're actually thinking. Then, I remember things too. I remember you singing. You were really bad at it. Something shifted on Ethan's face. Not quite a smile, not ready for that yet, but the place a smile comes from. I know, I'm still bad at it. Noah probably hates it. Noah has learned to sleep through it. Ava almost smiled. Almost. Then the weight of the evening settled back over her and she leaned against Victoria's arm and was quiet. The walk back to the main house was slow. Ethan carried Ava for part of it. She'd tired herself out and the grass was slippery. And Victoria walked beside them in the rain with her phone in her hand, calling off the search teams one by one. By the time they reached the back door, the security manager was waiting with towels, and the stunned relief of a man who has spent an hour dreading a phone call he now doesn't have to make. Victoria wrapped Ava in a towel and handed her to the nanny and said quietly, a warm bath and something to eat. I'll come up in 20 minutes. Then she turned back to the door. Ethan was still outside. Standing under the narrow overhang that didn't do much against the rain, which had not let up. He was wringing water from his jacket sleeve in a methodical way that seemed more like something to do with his hands than a practical effort. Victoria stepped outside and stood beside him. Thank you, she said. He shook his head slightly. Don't. I'm thanking you. You don't get to refuse it. She paused. You knew where she was. You knew because of something that happened 7 years ago that you should never have had to carry alone. He was quiet. The board met this afternoon, Victoria said. Before all of this, 3 members formally requested that I issue a public statement distancing the company from you. They used the phrase liability management. She said it the way she said things she found distasteful, flatly, without embellishment. I told them I'd consider it. He looked at her. That's the right move for the company. I didn't say I was going to do it. I said I'd consider it. She met his gaze. I'm not going to do it. Victoria, but Miranda is the liability, not you. And I will not protect a conspiracy by sacrificing the person it was built to destroy. She said it with the particular precision of someone who has made a decision and is not open to renegotiation. I have the financial transfer. My team found it this afternoon, before the Ava situation, which is why I didn't call you. A payment routed through 2 shell entities to a personal account Miranda holds under a different name. It's not everything, but it's enough to move. Ethan stood very still. 72 hours, Victoria said. That's what I asked for. We have maybe 48 now. When I act, it's going to be fast and it's going to be complete, and there's going to be a significant amount of noise. She paused. You need to be prepared for that noise to hit your name again before it clears. I can handle noise. I know you can. She looked at him in the rain. Your son, Is he with anyone tonight? My neighbor. She watches him when I work evenings. She's good. A pause. He knows something is going on. He's 7. He doesn't miss things. I told him I was helping a friend. Victoria thought about a 7-year-old boy at home with a neighbor while his father stood in the rain outside a house that had upended everything. He sounds like his father. He's better than his father, Ethan said. Simply, the way he said things that were true. Victoria looked out at the dark garden, rain silvered and quiet now. The searchlights switched off. The security team dispersed back to their posts. The estate looked the way it always had, large and well-maintained and entirely itself, indifferent to the things that happened inside it. You should go home, she said. Your son needs to see you. Yeah. He picked up the soaked jacket from the railing where he'd draped it. You'll call when it moves? You'll know when it moves. Everyone will? She paused. Ethan. He stopped. What you did tonight, not just finding her, the way you talked to her, the way you sat on that floor and didn't push. She looked for the right words and settled for the honest ones. She needed that. She's been needing something like that for a long time. He held the jacket in both hands and didn't say anything for a moment. His face did the thing it did when something landed harder than he was prepared for. A slight closing, a gathering, the expression of a man who has trained himself to absorb rather than react. She's a good kid, he said finally. She always was. He walked around the side of the house toward the main drive. Victoria watched him go. Then she went inside to check on her daughter. Ava was in the bath when Victoria arrived, which meant the worst of the evening's tension had passed. Ava only agreed to baths when she felt safe enough to be still. Victoria sat on the small chair beside the tub, and they talked about nothing in particular for a few minutes, the way you do when you're both recovering from something and need to let the ordinary close back over it. Then Ava said, without looking up from the water, he said not without telling me first. Before. At the gala. I know. He meant it. I believe he did. Ava looked up. Her eyes were calmer now, the tear puffiness fading. Is he going to be okay? Really? Victoria reached over and pushed a wet strand of hair off her daughter's forehead. I'm going to make sure of it. How? The same way I handle anything that's wrong. She met her daughter's eyes. I pull everything into the light where everyone can see it, and I don't let anyone look away. Ava considered that. And then what happens to the people who did the bad things? They face the consequences, which is a grown-up way of saying the wrong thing catches up to them. Does it always? Victoria paused. She almost said yes because it would have been easier. Not always. But this time, yes. This time I'm going to make sure of it. Ava settled back in the water with the satisfied expression of a child who has received a true answer and recognized it as such. Victoria sat with her until the water cooled, then helped her out and into pajamas and walked her to her room and sat on the edge of the bed for a while after the light went out. She could hear her daughter's breathing even out into sleep, the particular rhythm of a child who has worn themselves out with feeling things. She sat in the dark and thought about the next 48 hours. The board meeting she'd need to call, the legal team she'd have to have on standby, the communications plan she needed to build in the hours between now and when she acted. Because when she acted, it had to be coordinated and immediate, and it had to hold. She thought about her father, who she still hadn't spoken to, who had signed off, she was now almost certain, on Miranda's request to remove Ethan 7 years ago, who had believed he was protecting the family and had instead planted something in his granddaughter that took 6 years to surface and 9 days at a charity gala to begin to name. She was going to have to call him, not yet, but soon, before the board meeting. She needed to know where he stood before she stood in front of the room. She thought about Ethan Cross, driving home in a wet jacket to a 7-year-old with rocks on his windowsill, choosing every day to show up for his son the way he'd chosen, the night of the gala, the night of the guest house, all the quiet moments in between, to show up for a child who wasn't his, because that was the architecture of the man he'd built himself into. And she thought about the moonlight in the second room on the left of an abandoned guest house, dim after years of dark, but still on, still going. Some things, it turned out, waited. She got up, kissed her daughter's forehead in the dark, and went back downstairs to work. She called her father at 6 in the morning, not because she wanted to, and not because the time was right, There was no right time for this conversation. She'd accepted that somewhere around 2 a.m. while building the communications framework for the board meeting. She called it 6 because it was the hour her father had always been most honest. Something about the early morning, the absence of his usual armor, the fact that he hadn't yet assembled the day's performance, made him more himself. She'd known that since she was a girl, and she was using it now without particular apology. He picked up on the second ring. Vic. His voice was the voice of a man who'd been awake for a while. I heard about Ava. Is she all right? She's fine. She's sleeping. Victoria was at her kitchen counter with her third coffee of the night, which meant she'd crossed over from late to early without sleeping in between. Dad, I need to talk to you about something, and I need you to not be the chairman of the board while I do it. I need you to be my father and answer me honestly. A silence. She could hear him breathing, could almost see him in the study of his house, in the way she'd seen him 1,000 mornings, robe, reading glasses on the desk, the specific stillness of a man who understood that a pause communicated as much as words. All right, he said, 7 years ago. Miranda came to you about Ethan Cross. The pause that followed was a different kind, shorter but denser. Yes, he said. She told you he was a liability, that his relationship with Ava was inappropriate, that removing him was necessary to protect the family. That's what she said. And you authorized it. I did. Victoria set her mug down. Did you believe her? Another pause. This one had something uncomfortable moving through it. The discomfort of a person who is about to be honest about something they've spent years not being honest about. I believe she had a concern worth acting on. I didn't. I didn't investigate the claim independently. I should have. He asked to say goodbye to her, a proper goodbye. They refused him that. I didn't know that was part of it. Did you ask? Silence. Dad? No, he said quietly. I didn't ask. I trusted Miranda's management of the situation, and I moved on. He paused. I've been thinking about it since the gala, since I saw the news and understood who he was. How long have you been thinking about it? Since that night, 9 days. 9 days, Victoria repeated. And you didn't call me. You were handling it. You handle things. He said it not as a deflection, but as something that sat between pride and guilt, in a way she recognized because she'd felt the same combination herself recently. I wasn't ready to say out loud what I'm saying to you now. That I made a decision I didn't think hard enough about. That I gave someone authority over a situation I should have examined myself. That a child paid for it. His voice had aged over the course of the conversation. It did that sometimes, shedding its professional register, becoming the voice of a man in his late 60s who had made his share of mistakes and was tired of holding some of them. I'm sorry, Victoria, for what it cost Ava, for what it cost that man. She stood in her kitchen and heard the apology and knew it was real, and knew also that real apologies don't undo the thing they're apologizing for. They just mark the place where you stop pretending the thing didn't happen. I need you at the board meeting, she said, not just as a member. I need you on the right side of what's about to happen, visibly and completely. Miranda has been feeding information to the Harlow group. I have the evidence, the access logs, the financial transfer, corroborating communications. I'm moving against her today. A sharp intake of breath. You're certain? I am. How long has this been going on? Based on the documentation, at least 14 months, possibly longer. The Harlow bid is built entirely on information she fed them. Victoria picked up her mug again. She's been dismantling us from inside, and she used what she did to Ethan as the scaffolding, because if her personnel decision 7 years ago ever came to light, it would raise questions about her judgment and her loyalties and her access. So she kept the story buried and kept discrediting anyone who got close to it. The silence from her father was long and contained something she hadn't heard in it very often. Genuine shock. Not the managed kind, not the strategic kind. The real thing. Tell me what you need me to do, he said. She told him. The board meeting was called for 10 a.m. with 48 hours notice, which was short enough to prevent significant positioning and long enough to be procedurally clean. Victoria's assistant sent the calendar invites at 7:15, which gave people 2 hours and 45 minutes to wonder what it was about before they had to sit down and find out. Victoria used those 2 hours and 45 minutes to shower, change, and arrive at the building 20 minutes before anyone else. She wanted to be in the room first. She wanted to have already chosen her seat and settled into it and be entirely calm by the time the other 11 people walked through the door. This was not a performance of dominance. It was the management of her own nerves, which she had learned not to display in rooms where displaying them cost things she wasn't willing to lose. Her general counsel arrived at 9:50 and sat beside her without speaking, which was what she'd asked him to do. He had a laptop and a hard copy of the evidentiary summary. 63 pages, bound, a copy at each seat. He'd had 4 people working through the night to compile it. It was as clean as 63 pages assembled in under 48 hours could be, which was clean enough. Her father arrived at 9:55 and sat at the opposite end of the table from Miranda. He didn't look at Miranda when he sat down. He looked at Victoria, briefly, and gave her the small nod that had meant, "I'm here, go," since she was a child presenting things to adults who intimidated her. Miranda arrived at 9:58. She was in her usual blazer, charcoal this iteration, with her hair in its customary severe arrangement, and she carried herself into the room with the ease of a person who has survived enough board meetings to know how to read one. Victoria watched her clock the bound documents at each seat, watched her reach her chair and look at the one placed in front of her without touching it. Then Miranda looked up, found Victoria's eyes across the length of the table, and held them. She knew. Victoria could see it. The instant of recognition, the quick recalculation behind her expression. She knew what this meeting was, if not yet the full weight of the evidence. She'd been in this business long enough to read a bound document and a room full of people who aren't talking. But knowing didn't mean she was done. Miranda had survived a lot of things by the efficient application of nerve, and she was not the type to show her hand simply because someone else had shown theirs. "Should we wait for the full committee?" Miranda said, with the practiced calm of someone buying 30 seconds to think. "Everyone's here," Victoria said. The last 2 members had walked in behind Miranda. The door closed. Victoria looked around the table. 11 faces, some open, some guarded, several already visibly uncomfortable, which meant they'd spent the last 2 hours and 45 minutes making educated guesses about why they'd been called in, and their guesses weren't far off. "Thank you for coming on short notice," Victoria said. "I'll be brief with the context because the documents in front of you are detailed, and I want to give you time to read them. What I'm presenting this morning is the result of a 2-week internal investigation into a series of security breaches and personnel actions that directly impact this company's integrity and legal standing." She paused. "The investigation has established, with documented evidence, that senior executive Miranda Hale has been providing confidential acquisition data to the Harlow Group over a period of at least 14 months, in exchange for undisclosed financial compensation. The evidentiary package includes server access logs, financial transaction records traced through 2 shell entities, communication records, and corroborating testimony from 3 witnesses. The room had gone the specific kind of quiet that happens when people are trying to look neutral while managing a strong internal reaction. 2 people opened the bound document immediately. 3 others were looking at Miranda. Miranda was looking at Victoria. "That's an extraordinary allegation," Miranda said. Her voice had not changed. This was perhaps the most impressive thing about her. The absolute composure, the refusal to flinch. Victoria had always found it admirable in a technical sense, the way you can find an adversary's skill admirable while still opposing it entirely. "It is," Victoria agreed, "which is why I spent 2 weeks building the documentation before bringing it to this room. Page 12 covers the access logs. Page 29 covers the financial trail. Page 41 is the communication record." She paused. "Take your time." What followed was 20 minutes of the kind of silence that has texture. The sound of pages turning, of people shifting in chairs, of someone near the end of the table doing the involuntary quiet exhale that happens when you read something that genuinely surprises you. Miranda did not open her copy. She sat with her hands in her lap and her face in its neutral arrangement and waited with the patience of someone who has decided that their best move is to let the other person finish before responding. Victoria used the 20 minutes to drink water and watch the room. Her father read the whole thing. She could see him working through it methodically, the same way he'd read contracts her whole childhood, annotating in the margin with a pen he'd produced from his jacket pocket, pausing at certain pages, going back. When he finished, he set the document down and looked at Miranda with an expression Victoria hadn't seen on his face in a long time. It was not anger, exactly. It was the look of a man who has just understood the full scope of how he was used. "I'd like to speak," Miranda said, when the room had settled. "Of course," Victoria said. "These documents represent one interpretation of a complex pattern of activity. Many of the transactions cited have legitimate business explanations. The access logs show normal executive-level access to files within my operational mandate, and the allegation of financial impropriety—" She paused. "I'd want my counsel present before addressing that in detail." "That's your right," Victoria said, "and you'll have that opportunity through the appropriate channels. What you won't have is continued executive access to Sterling Corporation systems, personnel files, or board communications, effective immediately." She looked at the board member nearest the door, a man named Garrett, who had been in security management before joining the board. "Garrett, I'd like you to coordinate with building security. Ms. Hale's credentials should be suspended at the close of this meeting." Garrett nodded. His expression said he had no objection. "You can't remove my access without a full board vote," Miranda said. The composure had developed a very slight edge. Not anger, she was too controlled for anger, but pressure. The sound of something that has been held tightly beginning to require more effort. "I can suspend access as a precautionary measure pending investigation under Section 14 of the Executive Conduct Agreement you signed 4 years ago." Victoria had memorized the relevant section the night before because she'd known this moment was coming, and she did not make arguments she wasn't fully equipped to finish. "A vote on permanent removal will follow. Today's meeting is informational and precautionary." Miranda looked at the table. Then she looked at Victoria's father. "Richard, you've known me for 15 years. You know I have always acted in the best interest of this company." Richard Sterling looked at her for a long moment. He had the pen still in his hand. He set it down on the table with a small, deliberate sound. "I thought I knew that," he said. "I'm no longer certain." He paused. "I'm also no longer certain about some of the decisions I made in the past based on your counsel, which is a separate conversation, but a necessary one." His voice was measured. "I support my daughter's motion to suspend access pending the investigation." The vote, when Victoria called it, was 9-2. The 2 dissenting votes came from board members whose relationships with Miranda were longest, and whose exposure, Victoria noted, would need to be examined in the second phase of the investigation. She filed that for later. Miranda stood when the vote was confirmed. She gathered her copy of the document, she still hadn't opened it, and picked up her phone and her portfolio with the measured movements of a person performing composure for an audience, because performing it was the only version left. At the door, she stopped. She turned and looked at Victoria. Her face had done something over the last 30 minutes. Not cracked, not collapsed, but shifted. The absolute smoothness of it had given way to something that was harder to read, something older and less constructed. "You would have done the same thing in my position," Miranda said. "Given the same access, the same information, the same opportunities." Victoria looked at her across the length of the room. "No," she said. "I wouldn't have. And I think you know that." Miranda left. The room exhaled. The work that followed was not dramatic. That was the thing about the aftermath of something like this. The movies would have it clean and cathartic, everyone breathing relief, the resolution immediate and satisfying. In practice, it was administrative, calls to legal, a statement to be drafted and approved, HR processes to be initiated for the suspension, a communication to the full staff that was honest but not inflammatory, an urgent response to the Harlow Group's bid that required legal strategy and precision and couldn't be rushed. Victoria handled all of it through the afternoon. Her father stayed until 3 o'clock, working beside her in a way he hadn't in years. Not the chairman and the CEO, but just 2 people from the same family trying to put something right. At one point, during a break while the lawyers were on a call in the adjacent room, he said, "I want to meet him." Victoria looked up from her laptop. "Ethan." "Yes." "Why?" He thought about it. "Because I owe him an apology. A direct one." He looked at his hands on the table. Older hands, she noticed, in the way you notice things about your parents periodically that you've been not noticing for years. "I've been in this business long enough to know that not all debts are financial. Some of them are personal, and you have to pay them in person." "I'll arrange it," she said, The criminal referral to the Financial Crimes Unit was filed at 4:17. Victoria's general counsel handled the call while she reviewed the parallel civil filing. By 5 o'clock, Miranda Hale was the subject of an active investigation that would, in the months to come, expose not only the Harlow transaction, but two prior arrangements with competitive entities she'd serviced while inside the Sterling Corporation, a pattern of behavior that suggested, as Victoria's lead attorney put it, a long-standing secondary career. Victoria received the confirmation of the criminal referral via email. She read it, forwarded it to her legal team with 3 words: "Keep me updated," and then put her phone face down on the desk and sat quietly for a moment. She thought about what Miranda had said at the door. "You would have done the same thing in my position." She turned it over in her mind the way she'd turn over any claim she'd been handed, looking at it from different angles, checking it for truth. She didn't think it was true. But she also understood why Miranda had said it, not as a defense, but as a last attempt at something, at making what she'd done feel less singular, less like a choice that was entirely her own. "Anyone would have" was the oldest reframing in the world, and it almost never was true, but people needed it to be. She called Ethan at 5:30. He picked up on the first ring. "It's done," she said. "Miranda has been suspended. The financial crimes referral is filed. The Harlow bid is being challenged on the basis of fraudulently obtained information, which means it's effectively dead." She paused. "Your employment records have been restored. My legal team is filing a defamation claim against the outlets that ran the smear pieces. The sourcing traced back to Miranda's contacts, which means there's an evidentiary basis." A silence on his end. Not the silence of someone processing bad news. A different kind. The silence of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just been told they can set it down, and is standing there trying to believe that's actually true. "Ethan." "Yeah." His voice was slightly uneven, just slightly. "Sorry, give me a second." She gave him a second. "Thank you," he said. "Don't." She used his own word back at him and let the symmetry sit there. "You don't get to thank me for correcting something my family's negligence caused. Victoria, my father wants to meet you, a real meeting, not the board version of him, not the chairman. He knows what he owes you, and he intends to pay it in person." She paused. "You don't have to agree to that, but I told him I'd ask." A longer pause. "He can ask me himself." "Fair enough." She heard background sound on his end, the particular ambient noise of a kitchen, something being moved on a counter. "Noah's been asking about Ava," Ethan said. "He knows there's a situation. He doesn't know the details, but he knows his dad has been involved in something. He asked me this morning if the girl from the news was okay." Victoria felt something move through her, the unexpected warmth of it. A 7-year-old boy following a story because it involved his father, asking about a girl he'd never met. "She's okay. She's been asking about him too, actually." "Yeah?" "She called him Noah from the gala photo. I don't know how she found a photo." Victoria paused. "She's resourceful. She's her mother's daughter," Ethan said, and it landed exactly the way she'd said the same thing in the rain outside the guest house. Neither flattery nor criticism, just a true thing stated plainly. Victoria found herself almost smiling. Almost. "I'll call you tomorrow about next steps. The legal process has a timeline that'll affect your schedule." She paused. "And Ethan, the board raised the question of whether you would consider a formal role, an advisory position in estate and personal security. The compensation would be no. Quick, certain. It's a significant, I know what it's worth," he said, "and I'm not interested in being compensated for. It shouldn't be a transaction. None of this should be a transaction." He said it the way he said things he'd thought through. "I have work. I have Noah. I have enough." She thought about pushing and decided against it. "All right. But," he paused, "there's one thing. If you want to do something, name it. Ava's going to need some time to process all of this. A therapist who works with kids. Someone good, not just someone expensive." He said it without awkwardness, which surprised her because most people hedged around suggestions that implied something was being mishandled. "She's carrying a lot for a 6-year-old. She's been carrying it for a while. She needs someone to help her put it down properly." Victoria sat very still for a moment. She recognized the particular quality of what he'd just said. Not a criticism delivered sideways, not a performance of concern, but genuine attention to a child he had no formal claim to and had every reason to walk away from. "I'll make some calls tomorrow," she said. "Good." A pause. "She's a good kid, Victoria. She's going to be fine, but she'll be better with help." "Yes," Victoria said. "She will." She ended the call and sat in the quiet of her office. Through the glass wall, she could see the legal team still at it in the conference room, laptops and coffee cups, and the particular posture of people in the middle of something that isn't finished. On her desk was the framed photo that had lived there for 3 years. Ava at 3, at the beach somewhere, laughing at something off camera. Victoria had always liked it because the laugh was unguarded. Not the performed smile of a child who'd learned to smile for cameras, but the real thing, wide and uncalculated. She looked at it now and thought, that child has been in there all along, behind the careful composure, waiting for something to be safe enough to come out. She thought about the moonlight in the abandoned guest house, dim but still on. She thought about what it had taken, a gala, a rainstorm, 2 weeks of late nights and early mornings, and one of the harder board meetings of her career, to get to a point where she could tell a man his honor was restored and mean it in every legal and factual and human sense. She thought about her daughter sleeping in a room in a house 20 minutes away, and about a boy with rocks on his windowsill whose father had come in out of the rain. She thought about the ways things break, quietly, incrementally, through decisions that seem manageable at the time, and about how rarely they break back together along the same lines. When things healed, they healed differently. You could see where the damage had been. You carried the shape of it. That wasn't, she had decided somewhere in the last 9 days, the worst thing. At 7 o'clock, she closed her laptop. She told the legal team to wrap up what they could and continue tomorrow. She said goodnight to the 2 people still at their desks. She took the elevator down and got into her car. She drove to the estate. Ava was asleep when she arrived, which she'd expected. It was past her bedtime, and the last several days had worn her out in the deep, physical way that emotional exhaustion wears children out. Victoria sat on the edge of her daughter's bed in the dark for a while and watched her sleep, which she hadn't done enough of when Ava was small, and she'd been too busy and too tired and too many things at once. She was doing it now. That had to count for something. In the morning, she thought, she'd tell Ava what had happened. Simply, in words a 6-year-old could hold. She'd tell her that the people who'd been saying bad things about Ethan had been found out. And that found out was what eventually happened to bad things when someone looked hard enough and long enough and refused to stop looking. She'd tell her that Ethan's name was cleared. She'd find the right word for cleared, something concrete enough for a child to understand. She'd tell her that his son Noah had asked whether she was okay. She thought that last part might make Ava smile. She was looking forward to seeing that. Outside the window, the October night was clear, finally. The rain had moved through and left the sky clean and cold behind it, the kind of dark that has stars in it if you look. Victoria looked for a moment before she pulled the curtain. Then she tucked the blanket more securely around her daughter and stood up and went to find something to eat for the first time since morning, because she was human and she'd been running on coffee and determination for 16 hours, and her hands had started to shake slightly in the car, which was her body's way of submitting a complaint she intended to address. Tomorrow, there would be more work. There was always more work. But tonight, for the first time in 10 days, it would be a different kind. The work of building forward rather than fighting backward, of repairing rather than defending. That was a distinction she hadn't fully appreciated until now. She heated something from the refrigerator that she couldn't have named and ate it standing over the kitchen sink, looking at her reflection in the dark window glass. She looked tired. She was tired. She also looked, she thought, like someone who had done what they set out to do. That would be enough for tonight. The morning after the board meeting, Victoria told Ava the truth. Not all of it. Not the financial transfers or the legal filings or the particular corporate mechanics of what Miranda had done and what it would cost her. Ava was 6. The architecture of white-collar crime was not something a 6-year-old needed at breakfast, but the essential truth, stripped to its bones. The people who had been saying bad things about Ethan had been caught. The things they said were lies. Ethan's name was cleared. He was not in trouble. He was not going to disappear. Ava was eating toast when Victoria told her. She stopped mid-bite and looked at her mother with that particular focused attention she deployed when she was deciding whether to believe something. Caught how? She asked. I found proof. Documents. Records of what they did and why they did it. And they got in trouble? They did. The kind of trouble that follows people for a very long time. Ava thought about this. She took another bite of toast, chewed, swallowed. Did Ethan know yet? I told him last night. What did he say? Victoria paused. He said thank you, and then he asked me to make sure you had someone good to talk to, a professional, someone who helps kids work through hard things. Something moved across Ava's face. Surprise, but not displeasure. The surprise of a child who hasn't expected to be thought of and has just discovered they were. He asked about me? That was the first thing he asked about, Victoria said, before anything else. Ava set her toast down and was quiet for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, the October morning was doing something indecisive with the light. Neither fully cloudy nor fully clear, the kind of sky that can't commit. Then Ava said, Can I see him? Yes, we're going to arrange that. Soon. Soon. Ava picked her toast back up. Okay, she said, in the tone of a child who has decided that okay is sufficient for now and reserves the right to revisit this assessment at any time. That afternoon, Victoria called 3 child therapists whose names had come from 2 sources she trusted: a colleague who'd navigated something similar with her own daughter, and the pediatrician who had known Ava since birth and knew her particular emotional architecture better than most. She spoke to all 3 on the phone. She asked specific questions, not about credentials, which she could verify independently, but about approach. How do you talk to a child about loss that happened when they were too young to name it? How do you help a 6-year-old process grief that has been living in them as a kind of unnamed weather for years? The third one, a woman named Dr. Patricia Osei, said something that decided it. She said, The goal isn't to make her forget what happened. The goal is to help her build a relationship with it, to carry it without being carried by it. She said it without jargon, without the careful hedging that had marked the other 2 conversations. She sounded like someone who had spent a long time actually in rooms with children rather than reading about them. Victoria booked the first appointment for the following Thursday. Ethan met Richard Sterling on a Tuesday, 11 days after the board meeting. Victoria had offered to facilitate the meeting, to choose the location, to be present, to manage the variable of 2 men who had never been in the same room voluntarily, and one of whom owed the other a debt that couldn't be fully calculated. Ethan had told her he didn't need facilitation. Her father had said the same thing. She took them both at their word and gave them the address of a coffee place 2 blocks from the Sterling building that her father had been using for private conversations for 20 years. Unremarkable, unbothered, the kind of place that didn't care who you were. She heard about the meeting afterwards, separately, from both of them. Her father called her that evening. He said, He's a good man. He said it with the specific weight of a person who has met a lot of people and developed a reasonably accurate instrument for the measurement of them. I told him what I should have done 7 years ago and what I didn't do and why. He listened to the whole thing. He didn't try to make me feel better about it. That sounds right, Victoria said. He asked about Noah, whether I had grandchildren. We talked about what it's like to raise kids alone for a while. A pause. He's better than I expected, which tells me I'd built a picture of him based on what Miranda told me and never corrected it. That's on me. Yes, Victoria said, it is. I told him that too. Ethan's account of the meeting, offered the next day when Victoria called for an unrelated legal update and asked, was characteristically brief. He said his piece, I said mine. We had coffee. He asked if Noah played any sports. A pause. I think he meant well when he made the decision 7 years ago. I don't think meaning well covers what it cost, but I think he knows that. He's not a bad person. He made a bad call and trusted the wrong person and didn't ask enough questions. Does that, Victoria started. Does it what? Does it change anything for you? The apology. A silence. She could tell he was giving the question actual consideration rather than reaching for the comfortable answer. It changes the story a little, he finally said. It doesn't change what happened. Those are 2 different things. He paused. But yeah, it changes something. She thought that was probably as honest an answer as the question deserved. The first time Ava and Noah met was not arranged. That was the thing about it. Victoria had been building a careful plan for a supervised introduction, something thoughtful and age-appropriate and not too loaded with expectation, and instead it happened on a Saturday afternoon at the edge of the school park where Ethan had taken Noah to kick a ball around and where Victoria, on a different errand entirely, had stopped with Ava for 20 minutes because Ava had asked and because it was one of those October afternoons that made you say yes to things. Noah saw them first. He was chasing the ball near the fence line, and he stopped, picked it up, and said to his father, who was 20 feet away and hadn't looked up yet, "Dad, is that Ava Sterling?" Ethan turned. Victoria saw him from across the grass, and something passed between them. A brief look that had no clean label, the look two adults exchange when a situation removes their planning and hands them the real thing. Ava had already spotted Noah. She was holding Victoria's hand and had gone very still in the way she went still when she was processing something she hadn't prepared for. She knew about Noah. She'd known for weeks. But knowing about someone and suddenly seeing them as an actual person standing 20 feet away holding a soccer ball, looking at you with curious dark eyes, those were different experiences. "That's Noah," Victoria said quietly. "I know," Ava said. She didn't move for a moment. Then she looked up at her mother. "Is it okay to go say hi?" "Of course." She let go of Victoria's hand and walked across the grass. Not running. She'd outgrown the running at strangers' impulse, or she'd learned to manage it, or this was different enough that it called for different behavior. She walked at a considered pace, stopped a few feet from Noah, and said, "Hi, I'm Ava." Noah looked at her. He was taller than she'd expected, and he had his father's particular quality of steadiness, the kind of stillness in a kid that says they're actually paying attention rather than just waiting for their turn to speak. "I know," he said. "I've seen your photo. My dad has, well, he didn't have it on the wall or anything. He had it on his phone." "Oh," Ava said. Then, "Is that weird?" Noah considered the question with genuine seriousness. "A little bit," he said, "but not bad weird." Ava seemed to find this acceptable. She looked at the ball under his arm. "Do you actually know how to play, or are you just kicking it around?" "I actually know how to play." "I'm not very good," Ava said. "I'm better at reading." "I'm not very good at reading," Noah said. "I mean, I can read, I'm just slow." "That's okay. My teacher says everyone reads at their own speed." "Yeah, my teacher says that too. I think teachers probably all say that." Ava almost smiled. "Probably." They stood there for a moment with the comfortable awkwardness of two children who are both a little uncertain but also both a little interested, which is basically the best starting point there is. Then Noah held the ball out. "You want to try? I can show you where to kick it so it goes straight." "Okay," Ava said. Ethan arrived beside Victoria while this was happening. They stood at a slight distance and watched Noah demonstrate something about foot placement with the earnest authority of a 7-year-old who has been taught something and is now very serious about passing it on. "I had a whole plan," Victoria said. "Controlled environment. Dr. Osai's suggestion. Gradual introduction." Ethan said. "This is not that." "No." "Is this better?" He watched his son correct Ava's stance with a patience that looked more like his own than like a 7-year-old's. "Probably," he said. "Kids are better at this than adults give them credit for. Less invested in it going a specific way." Victoria watched Ava actually laugh. A real one, surprised out of her, when her kick went sideways and missed the fence post she'd been aiming at by 4 feet. Noah retrieved the ball without comment and set it up again with great seriousness. The afternoon light did something kind to all of it. "She's going to be okay," Ethan said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Victoria said. "She is." They stood in the familiar, semi-comfortable awkwardness of two people who have been through something significant together and are now standing on the other side of it without the urgency of crisis to organize around, which requires a different kind of navigation. "How's the legal stuff moving?" Ethan asked. "Miranda's counsel is trying to negotiate. My team isn't negotiating. The defamation suits against the outlets are filed. The Harlow bid has been formally challenged, and their counsel has gone quiet, which means they know how much of their case rests on fraudulently obtained information." She paused. "The criminal investigation will take time. These things always do, but the evidentiary foundation is solid." "And the board?" "The 2 members who voted against suspension are under review. One is probably just a loyalty problem. He's known Miranda a long time. It's personal more than professional. The other one I'm less certain about. We're looking at his access patterns." Ethan nodded. He was quiet for a moment. "How are you?" he asked. The question landed simply. She found she wasn't entirely prepared for it. The direct version, aimed at her, from someone who hadn't led with something he needed or something he was managing. I'm tired, she said, which was true. And I'm recalibrating, I think. The last few weeks changed the shape of some things I thought I understood. About the company? About several things. She paused. I spent a long time building a life that was very efficient. Good decisions, good outcomes, controlled variables. And I missed. She stopped. Looked at her daughter on the grass, lining up another kick. I missed a lot of interior things. In her. In myself. She didn't look at him while she said it, because some things were easier to say sideways. I've been thinking about what you said to her. In the guest house. About adults making decisions they believe are right and being wrong. That applies to me too, he said. I walked away when I should have found a way to fight. You had Noah. I had Noah. And I used that as the whole reason, which it mostly was. But partly I was also scared of losing, of going up against your family's resources and coming out the other side with nothing. He said it the way he said things he'd spent time being honest with himself about. Scared is a legitimate thing to be. It doesn't make the outcome less real. You were 27 years old with a 4-year-old and a threat from a woman who worked for one of the most powerful families in the city, Victoria said. What you call scared, most people would call rational. Maybe. He didn't push it further. That was another thing about him. He knew when a conversation had reached its actual point and didn't feel the need to keep driving past it. On the grass, Ava kicked the ball, and it went mostly straight. Noah pumped his fist. Ava looked at her foot like it had done something independent of her. Noah's going to want to come back here, Ethan said. Ava too, Victoria said. I know because she's already planning the next visit in her head. She does this thing where she gets very quiet and focused when she's organizing something internally. Where does she get that from? Ethan said flatly. Victoria pressed her lips together against something that wanted to be a laugh. That's not a question that needs an answer. He glanced at her sideways. The closest thing to a grin she'd seen on him, which was still fairly restrained but reached his eyes in a way that changed his whole face, briefly, and made him look less like a man carrying the sum of his experience and more like the person underneath it. It was a good face, she thought, when it did that. She looked back at the children. The weeks that followed were not a transformation. That was the most important thing about them. They were not a before and after, not a pivot point after which everything became different and better and resolved. They were incremental. They were irregular. They were two families who had arrived at an unlikely proximity through difficult means and were now figuring out, without a script, what to do with it. Ava saw Dr. Osei every Thursday afternoon. The sessions were private. Victoria dropped her off and waited in the car or worked in the small coffee shop down the block. And when Ava came out, she didn't always want to talk about what had happened inside, and Victoria had learned to not ask directly. What she noticed, over the weeks, was that Ava became gradually less braced. The careful watchfulness didn't disappear. It was probably structural by now, woven into who she was, but it loosened slightly, the way a fist loosens when it's been holding something and decides it doesn't have to grip so hard. Ava started sleeping better. Victoria noticed that too. Noah and Ava saw each other on Saturdays when schedules allowed, which was not every Saturday. Ethan worked some weekends, and Ava had activities, and life was life, which was irregular and didn't arrange itself around what would be narratively convenient. But more Saturdays than not, they found a few hours. The park, initially, and then, as the weather turned colder, indoor options. A children's museum that Noah found fascinating and Ava found somewhat beneath her, but enjoyed anyway because Noah's enthusiasm was contagious. A kitchen table where they did homework side by side because it turned out Ava was a patient explainer, and Noah's reading improved faster with a peer than with an adult. Noah showed Ava his rock collection. He had 43 rocks, each with a small handwritten label. She examined every one with the seriousness of a curator and asked where each had come from. He had an answer for most of them. This one is basalt, she said, holding up a dark, heavy one. From the river park, Noah said. The one near the bridge. It's igneous, she said. I know, Dad told me. He paused. Do you know about rocks? I read a book about geology, she said. It was in the school library. It wasn't very long, but it was good. Noah looked at her with the expression of a child encountering someone who reads about rocks voluntarily. That's kind of weird, he said. But okay, weird. Ava accepted this. Victoria and Ethan existed during these weeks in a space that didn't have a clean name. They weren't friends exactly. Friendship implied a choice made without complication, and everything between them had been complicated from the beginning. They weren't something more than that, not yet, not in any declared or deliberate way. They were two people who had ended up here together through a series of events that neither of them had engineered, who had discovered in each other a particular kind of, she thought about the word, and settled on steadiness. In each other's company, things were level. She trusted his judgment. He respected hers. They disagreed sometimes. He thought she worked too much and said so plainly. She thought he was too quick to minimize what he was owed and said so with equal plainness. And the disagreements didn't destabilize anything because neither of them was performing for the other. That was rare, she'd come to understand. Rarer than she'd fully appreciated before. They fell into a habit of talking in the evenings, sometimes for 20 minutes, sometimes for an hour. Never planned. One of them would call or text about something logistical, and the logistical thing would get handled, and then the conversation would continue. She told him things about the company she didn't tell most people, not because she needed advice, but because explaining them to someone outside the corporate world clarified her own thinking. He told her things about Noah, about the small daily accumulations of raising a kid alone, about the particular comedy and difficulty of being the only adult in a household with a 7-year-old who had opinions about everything from dinner to the optimal rock labeling system. He made her laugh. That surprised her. Not that he had humor, she'd glimpsed it in the sideways moments, but the frequency of it. He was dry and precise and occasionally absurd in ways she hadn't anticipated, and she found that she laughed with him more genuinely than she laughed in most of her professional interactions, which were full of performative amusement and almost entirely lacking in the real thing. She found herself looking forward to those calls. She noticed that. She didn't do anything about it for a while because there was enough to manage, and because she was cautious by nature, and because whatever this was deserved to develop at its own pace without someone forcing a shape onto it. In December, 2 months after the board meeting, Miranda Hale was formally charged. The charges covered wire fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and corporate espionage, 3 counts in the primary filing, with additional charges under review. Her legal team entered a not guilty plea, which was expected and which Victoria's counsel had prepared for. The trial would take time. These things always did. But the charge itself was public, which meant the story became public in a different way. Not the salacious media narrative that Miranda had engineered, but the documented legal reality, which was harder to spin and impossible to erase. The outlets that had run the smear pieces about Ethan settled quickly. Victoria's defamation attorneys had expected a fight and were mildly surprised by the speed. A sign, her lead attorney said, of how thin the sourcing actually was once Miranda's cover was removed, and the outlets understood the evidentiary exposure they were sitting on. The settlements were not enormous, but they included formal retractions, which were published in the same spaces the original pieces had run. Ethan read the retraction in his truck, parked outside the school where he'd just dropped Noah off. He read it twice. Then he put his phone in his jacket pocket and sat there for a few minutes, looking at the school fence, at the kids disappearing through the gate in 2s and 3s, backpacks and noise, and the ordinary morning business of children who had no idea about any of this. He thought about the version of himself that had stood in a parking lot 7 years ago and been walked to his truck by a man half his size who was just doing his job, who had driven away with nothing but the weight of a decision he couldn't explain to a 2-year-old because he'd been denied the chance. He thought about the years between then and now. Noah's gap-toothed first-grade smile, the single-father learning curve that was genuinely steep in ways nobody prepared you for, the maintenance contracts, and the early mornings and the evenings when he was so tired he sat at the kitchen table for 10 minutes before he could make dinner. The years of carrying something with no name for it because naming it meant thinking about it, and thinking about it meant feeling it, and he had a son to take care of, and that was the whole priority. He thought about a charity gala on a night he'd almost skipped because he'd been tired and his jacket needed dry cleaning, and he'd almost asked a colleague to cover it. He thought about small hands grabbing his uniform. He exhaled slowly. The cold air fogged the windshield from inside. He started the truck. There was a job this morning, a building over on the east side that needed its elevator mechanism inspected. I was going to go do that. He was going to stop for coffee on the way because he always stopped for coffee on the way. He was going to pick Noah up at 3:15 and ask about school and hear more about the rock. Noah had found at recess that he was convinced was quartz, but needed verification. I was going to make dinner that Noah would probably have notes on, because Noah always had notes on dinner. He was going to call Victoria at some point in the evening, not because there was anything specific to discuss, because that was what they did now. He pulled out of the school parking lot and into traffic and drove. The first time Ethan came for dinner at the estate. Not a planned event, not a milestone. Just a Thursday that slid from an afternoon where he'd brought Noah over for homework time, and nobody had made an active decision to leave. Ava set the table, all four places. She did it with the focused efficiency of someone who had decided this was their job and was taking it seriously. And when Ethan noticed and offered to help, she said, "I've got it," in the tone Victoria used when she meant the same thing, which made Ethan press his lips together to hide something. Dinner was pasta, which Noah considered an acceptable outcome, and Ava considered basic but fine. Victoria had made it herself, which she didn't do often, not because she couldn't, but because evenings were usually compressed into the wrong shape for cooking. Tonight the shape had been different. She'd put the pasta on while Ava set the table, and Ethan and Noah argued mildly in the background about whether the rock on the kitchen windowsill was quartz or quartzite, a distinction Noah had apparently introduced to the conversation and which Ethan was now being asked to arbitrate. "Dad, you have to look at the texture," Noah said. "I'm looking at the texture." "You're just holding it up." "Holding it up is how I look at the texture. That's not—" "Ava, tell him that's not how—" "I'm not getting involved," Ava said from the table, in a tone that suggested she found this entire debate mildly beneath her, but was enjoying it anyway. They ate at the big table in the kitchen rather than the dining room, which Victoria had suggested and nobody had objected to, because the dining room was formal, and this was not that. The conversation moved the way dinner conversation moves when people are comfortable, sideways, non-linear, on three tracks at once. Noah explained quartz versus quartzite with a thoroughness that suggested he'd looked it up specifically to use in this conversation. Ava asked Ethan what was the hardest thing he'd ever had to fix in a building. He said a water main that had burst in a basement at 3 in the morning in February, and she said that sounded terrible, and he said it was, actually. Victoria watched them from her side of the table and felt something she didn't try to name immediately. Just held it, let it be what it was. The full, complicated feeling of a moment that contains more than the moment. It wasn't perfect. Nothing about it was. Noah knocked over his water glass and the recovery was loud and damp. Ava got bossy about something minor and Victoria gave her the look, and she dialed it back with more grace than she usually managed at 6. The pasta was slightly overcooked. Ethan still had calluses on his hands and a scar on his jaw and the permanent slight furrow of someone who has carried things. And Victoria still had the particular tension she held in her shoulders when she was in the middle of 6 things at once, which she always was. They were all, in other words, exactly themselves. After dinner, Noah asked if he could look at Ava's book collection. She led him down the hall with the proprietary pride of someone showing something they care about, and their voices faded, and the kitchen was quiet for a moment with just the 2 adults and the cleared table and the October evening outside. "This is strange," Ethan said, not uncomfortably, observationally. "Very," Victoria agreed. "Good strange." "Yes." She looked at him across the table. "Yes." He looked at her for a moment with that steadiness he had, the quality of actually being present in a room rather than managing his presence in it. Then he said, I know there's no name for what this is." "No," she agreed. "I'm not in a hurry to find one." "Neither am I." She paused. "But I think whatever it is, it should keep going." "Yeah," he said. "I think so too." From down the hall came Noah's voice, insisting on something, and Ava's voice, equally insistent, and then a burst of both of them laughing about something neither adult would ever fully reconstruct. They both looked toward the sound. That was the thing about it. Neither of them had planned this. You cannot plan the specific shape of what happens when an honest question gets answered honestly, when something buried surfaces in a room full of people who weren't expecting it, when a child's grief turns out to have been the most truthful thing in the building for years. You cannot plan the way. 4 people find their way into the orbit of a single kitchen table on a Thursday evening without any one decision having made it happen, just a long accumulation of smaller decisions. To stay, to look, to not look away, to tell the truth when it was easier not to. What Victoria understood now that she hadn't understood at the beginning of October when she stood frozen in the middle of a charity gala watching her daughter run toward a stranger. What she understood now was that the question, "Why did you leave me?" had never really been about leaving. It had been about whether, having left, you would come back. Whether the people who mattered would show up when the thing was hard and stay when it was complicated and choose, every time the choice came up again, to be present. That was the question Ava had been asking for 6 years in 100 different ways. It was the question she'd finally asked out loud. And the answer, assembled not in a single dramatic gesture, but in a rainstorm, in an abandoned guest house, in a board meeting, in 43 labeled rocks and slightly overcooked pasta, and an evening that turned from an afternoon without anyone deciding to stay. The answer was yes. This time, yes. People carry their wounds in the shapes they were made, and some of those shapes are permanent. The altered architecture of a child who learned too young that people disappear, of a man who walked away from something important because he was scared of what fighting would cost, of a woman who built a brilliant, efficient life and left the interior rooms unattended for too long. None of them had come through this restored to some prior unblemished state. There was no unblemished state. There was just the version of yourself that you carried forward, with the marks of what had happened to you, making the next choice. The next choice was always the thing. On a Saturday late in November, Ava asked Ethan to come to her school's family celebration. She asked him directly, in the car on the way home from Dr. Osei's office, while Victoria was driving. She turned from the back seat and said, "It's a month from now. You can bring Noah. There's going to be food and you can see my classroom." Ethan, in the passenger seat, turned to look at her. "Yeah?" "Yeah," Ava said, with that careful steadiness of hers, not demanding, not pleading, just asking plainly, because she'd decided she was allowed to ask for things plainly. "I'll be there," he said. She nodded, satisfied, and looked out the window. Victoria drove and said nothing and felt the particular fullness of a moment she would come back to later in her memory. Not because it was large, but because it was real in all the ways the large moments hadn't quite been. No cameras, no board members, no documents or evidence or crisis to manage. Just a question asked, and an answer given on a Saturday afternoon in a car moving through ordinary city traffic, between people who had figured out, against the odds of their particular history, how to trust each other. The celebration was a month away. There was still work. There was always work. The legal process ground on at its own pace. The company was rebuilding structures that Miranda's tenure had undermined. And a 6-year-old in therapy was not a solved problem, but an ongoing one that required patience and attention and showing up every Thursday regardless of what else was happening. None of it was finished. But sitting at that kitchen table, hearing 2 children laugh down a hallway, watching the ordinary evidence of people choosing each other in the small daily ways that turn out to matter, more than the large declarations. Victoria understood that finished was not the point. The point was the choosing. The point was that you looked at the complicated, imperfect, still healing thing in front of you, and you chose it anyway, one honest day at a time. That was enough. For the first time in a very long time, it was genuinely enough.